Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Rumi Forum. I'm very happy to have Frederick Hess here with us today. He is the resident scholar and director of education policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Hess is a resident scholar and director of education policies at the American Enterprise Institute. He pens the Education Week blog, Rick Hess Straight Up, has authored influential books on education, including The Same Thing Over and Over, Education Unbound, Common Sense, School Reform, Revolution at the Margins, and Spinning Wheels, and is co-editor of the new volume, Stretching the School Dollar. His work has appeared in scholarly and popular outlets such as the Teachers College Record, Harvard Education Review, Social Science Quarterly, Urban Affairs Review, American Politics Quarterly, Chronicle of Higher Education, Phi Delta Kappan, Educational Leadership, U.S. News and World Report, The Washington Post, and National Review. He has edited widely cited volumes on education philanthropy, urban school reform, the impact of education research, education entrepreneurship, and No Child Left Behind. He serves as executive editor of Education Next, as lead faculty member for the Rice Education Entrepreneurship Program, on the review board for the Broad Prize in Urban Education, and on the boards of directors of the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, 4.0 Schools, and the American Board for Certification of Teaching Excellence. A former high school social studies teacher, he has taught at the University of Virginia, the University of Pennsylvania, Georgetown University, Rice University, and Harvard University. He holds an MA and PhD in government from Harvard University, as well as an MEd in teaching and curriculum. Please welcome Mr. Hess.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. What I'm here to chat with you about today a little bit is my recent book, The Same Thing Over and Over, published by Harvard University Press just a couple months back. Premise is simple. We recently had Michelle Rhee, who's come to some national renown, spend close to 4 years as superintendent of schools. Much of what Michelle did was controversial. One of her interesting endeavors should not have been at all controversial. She had the insight that if you're trying to get families of at-risk students more involved in those kids' education, it made sense to give those families certain pieces of information, one of which was whether their kid had been in school that day. She thought parents could probably be more helpful if they knew if a kid was in school or was absent. Some call this a radical idea. This is Michelle's brand of fresh thinking. Problem was, at the time they came up with this idea, Michelle's team realized it took 8 business days, give or take, for the DC public schools to inform parents that their child had been in school. By the time the teacher took attendance, put the stickies on the sheet, hung it on the door, it was collected by the office, somebody came around from central administration, it was entered in the data processing, it was cleaned. Apparently it was on the order of about 8 business days, or close to 2 weeks. So one of her team members, one of these radical thinking young people she'd hired, came up with the notion that there was a new piece of technology which could facilitate taking attendance. It was called the laptop computer. They'd heard some teachers had them. They could give them to others. So the idea was, instead of going through this whole process, why don't we give teachers laptop computers, have them take attendance on the laptop. Same afternoon, parents at these 3 schools that were in the pilot program would know if their child had been in school or was absent. Problem was that when they took this to the Washington Teachers Union, the local teachers union, there was agreement that taking attendance was permissible work duty for teachers. No problem. But it is not permitted, according to the teacher contract, to require teachers to do data entry. And the lawyers explained that taking attendance on a computer constituted data entry. Took them 12 weeks They eventually got a memoranda of understanding for the 3 schools that permitted them to do this. This, to my mind, in a nutshell, is the trick with so much that's frustrating about education reform. That even the most thoughtful leaders, even the most thoughtful superintendents and principals and educators aren't in a position to just solve problems. Instead, they're asked to go into organizations where they must overcome decades of accumulated rules and regulations, of contracts and culture. And we just take this for granted. So when we think we're coming up with new creative ideas to address these problems, we rarely attack them head on. We rarely talk about how do we start to remove some of these burdens so that educators can simply educate the kids. Instead, we try to come up with over-the-top solutions which we figure are going to make all of this go away. So when we talk about merit pay in education, we don't do it the way we do in most walks of life, which is to say, yeah, makes sense to pay good workers more than bad workers. That seems pretty intuitive. There's a lot of different ways to measure if somebody's good or bad, and none of them are perfect. So let's try to figure out what's a sensible way to do this. Instead, we have moral crusades in which we are going to measure whether teachers are good in every school, in every classroom in that district with some instrument which measures movement and test scores. And one side lines up and says, we have to prove that this works, and then we have to do it for everyone. And the other side winds up saying, we can't possibly imagine drawing distinctions between good and bad teachers. Because unlike everybody else in the world, apparently, it's impossible to have any vague idea of whether one teacher is better than another. This strikes me as a bizarre debate. But it's because instead of trying to think about the stuff of schooling, instead of trying to figure out how do we start to recognize who's doing good work, what constitutes a good team, and how do you steer dollars to people who are more valuable, it's because we're trying to superimpose a big policy solution over the top. We have big debates about mayoral control of education. School boards are dysfunctional in many cases, especially in big urban places. But that's not the only problem school districts have. If you had a uniform, disciplined, responsible leader in a school system, it wouldn't make that frustration that Michelle encountered have gone away. It was still there. It was baked into the bureaucracy and the contracts and the work routines and the culture. So we talk about mayoral control, and in fact, Michelle was working for a mayor who appointed her and who had been given control of the system. But that didn't solve the problem. Merit pay and mayoral control are tools, but we tend to use them clumsily. We tend to talk about them as solutions. And when you talk about them as solutions in their own right, it leads us to lazy, sloppy thinking. Here's the reality. The reality is that American schools look like they do because they were built to look like they do. The first compulsory education law in the U.S. was passed 3.5 centuries ago in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1647. It took us from 1647 until 1970, 14 generations, just to get 90% of kids to show up in school each day. A century ago, only 1 American in 10 even finished high school. The notion that everybody's going to finish high school is a modern idea. It's only been a reality, really, since World War II, that even half of Americans finished high school. As soon as we got most people to just finish high school, as soon as we got 90% of our kids to show up each day, we were in an environment where we suddenly realized that it wasn't just enough to get kids through schools, that we needed kids to get great educations. Nation at Risk in 1983 announced this in bold language. Is anybody surprised that a school system built over 3.5 centuries with the primary purpose of getting kids into a building where they would get some minimal education wasn't up to the challenge? It wasn't built to be up to the challenge. Why is American teaching predominantly feminine profession? Has education always been a feminized profession? No. In 1810, 3/4 of teachers were men. It was something men did itinerantly, often while they were looking for another career or while they were enrolled in university. We turned teaching into a feminized profession in the course of the 1800s because we needed cheap labor. As Horace Mann and the Common School Reformers sought to build out the common schools in the middle of the 19th century, there weren't enough men to fill these schools. It was too much money. So they decided we could do this with women who they could pay half as much or a third as much. So we built a teaching profession built on cheap labor that was thought to be interchangeable. Well, in the early part of the 20th century, when we did step and lane pay scales where all teachers were paid the same, it was actually an advance. It didn't make any sense to pay female teachers half of what we paid their male counterparts. So the step and lane pay scale was actually a reasonable policy. These teachers had no protection whatsoever. There were no civil service job protections a century ago. So teachers were getting fired because their weight didn't conform to the state's required weight charts based on their height. In such times, tenure protections made sense. Today, though, we're in a very different environment. In the 1950s, over half of women who graduated college became teachers. Today, it's 15%. In the 1960s, the average college graduate was going to have 5 jobs before they retired. Today, they're going to have 4 jobs before the age of 30. Once upon a time, tenure was an essential protection for teachers. Today, they have the same protections as any other state worker. All tenure does is make it impossible to fire bad ones. Once upon a time, there was massive gender and race discrimination in how we paid teachers. Step and lane pay scales made sense. Today, we don't have that problem, yet we find it very difficult to even talk about paying good teachers more than bad teachers. So for my mind, the trick as we think about school reform is not to imagine that we can take today's schools and today's teachers and simply get better ones. Simply pass some policy that will fix it. Simply fall in love with some new pedagogy or some new instructional approach. What we need to do, if we don't want to do the same thing over and over, is start to think differently about how do we solve problems. We have technologies today that were once unimaginable. Today, somebody with a PhD in chemistry in Boston can tutor a kid on a farm in southern Mississippi. Today, we've got computer-assisted instruction. The same kind of thing kids are spending 4 hours an evening playing with at home, except it'll actually teach them literacy skills and build their phonetic awareness. Do we want to do that instead of having them with a teacher? No, that's not the point. The point is we've got tools that we didn't used to have. We've got a teaching force that was built for a 19th century labor market. It doesn't make sense today. We talk about trying to find 3.4 million good teachers. Good luck with that. On the other hand, there's ways to tap talent. There's ways to use the teachers we have smarter and better. So to my mind, the way to really think about transformative educational improvement, about going from where we are, not just in baby steps, but towards terrific schools that can serve all our kids, is to start thinking about the stuff of schooling. How did we get where we are? Do those routines, do those rules make sense? And if not, how do we start transforming them for a new century? Thanks so much.
Thank you. Several things came to my mind while you were speaking, and I had looked at an article last week, can't remember if it was the Washington Post, about schools in Finland and teachers in Finland and other parts of the world. And do you think that there's any benefit for us to look into giving more, raising our perspective, the weight that we place on being a teacher and the importance of being a teacher? It's kind of, we don't seem to have that importance that these other countries seem to place on this role. Do you think that that has any bearing on the U.S. and how we look at teachers and how we can make education better?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think culture always matters, and what any community, what any nation values,
Sure.
is going to affect how they spend their dollars.
Absolutely.
What their kids want to do. Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple interesting notes here. One is Teach for America has been attacked for 20 years for deprofessionalizing teachers, because Teach for America presumes that teachers will come in, teach many cases 2 or 3 years, rather than spend a lifetime. Now, again, this makes sense in the modern labor market, because almost any of us who hire 22-year-olds today don't expect them to still work for us when they're 52. That's just not the way the 21st century labor market works. So you might say that Teach for America makes a lot more sense. But the reality is they've been attacked for deprofessionalizing teaching, which strikes me as ludicrous. A quarter of students at places like Yale and Princeton are applying to go into Teach for America. People who once wouldn't have thought about teaching now find teaching, at least if it's through the right through the right doorway, to be incredibly attractive.
Right.
We've got people who used to go straight into Wall Street or into something like the Peace Corps, now are eager to become teachers. And I think that has a profoundly beneficial effect on how we think about teaching. More fundamentally, one of our big mistakes, I think, in how we've approached this, because our mindset tends to be, well, we're not going to rethink schooling, we're going to do more of it. It's kind of this more better mindset. What we have today is not working very well, so we'll spend more money and hire more people and buy more computers, and that'll be great. Which I don't think recognizes the fact that if you're stuck, doing more of the same just digs the hole a little deeper. But in the 1970s, for instance, we had 23 students for every teacher that we had in American schooling. Today, we have about 15 students for every teacher. So one of the things we've done by increasing the number of teachers 50% faster than we've added students is this has soaked up dollars. We could pay every teacher in this country 50% more than we do today if we just had schools staffed at the same ratio we did back in 1973. We've chosen to use those dollars to buy quantity rather than quality. When you buy quantity, you dilute. That means we can't pay people as much, which makes it harder to attract the best. And it means we need more, which makes it hard to be more selective. When you need more, it's harder to train them well. It's harder to be picky. So I think one of the things that we've done is by going with this quantity rather than quality mindset, is we've actually made it harder over the last 35 or 40 years to build a culture of respect for teaching.
Right. So I was thinking also about my social studies teacher back in 8th grade, and how it just seemed like he had been there forever, and compared to the other teachers that I had, he doesn't seem, the younger, fresher teachers didn't seem as innovative, creative, and actually at the end of the day really didn't seem to want to be there, period. So, but was there because he was tenured, and he, was going to retire, and it wasn't at retirement age yet. It was coming, but it wasn't there yet. But he wasn't doing much for his students. Nice man, but so how can we solve this problem?
Yeah. So there's one way to think about this. There's a bunch of compacted problems. Partly because, again, if we recognize that our schools are doing what they were built to do, it's just what they were built to do doesn't necessarily work today. So one of the reasons teachers stay in, perhaps after they're ready to move on to a new profession or a new challenge, is because we punish them if they leave. We've got pension systems, for instance, in which teachers get creamed if they've stayed in more than 5 or 6 years, because they start to make big contributions. And then if they leave before year 25, they get crushed. And if they stay after year 25, they get crushed. So there's this presumption that this is the time you leave, year 25 or year 30. Now this made sense. This used to be state of the art. This used to be state of the art because it was how the United Auto Workers and the United Steel Workers won their pension wars back in the 1930s and 1940s. And what we put in schools was the best way we knew to reward and retain professional talent 70 years ago. Problem is, A, those businesses tend not to be doing so well today, the Bethlehem Steels of the world, General Motors, because these models that made sense when you hired 18 or 22-year-olds and you just wanted them to live in one community and stay in one place and work for you for 30 years doesn't reflect the reality today. And two, it's probably a really lousy model if you're competing for educated workers. When most of your teachers are women who had no other career alternatives other than nursing, and you weren't worried about competing for talent, it was pretty reasonable. They were going to stay in your community. They were married to their husband. You just wanted to create an environment where they would just stay in one place for 30 years. Well, that's not the kind of talent we're competing for in schools today. But we've got pension and benefit systems that reward people who teach 20 and 25 years and punish you early on. This is what we've seen debated in Wisconsin recently, for instance. This is what states like Maryland and New York are wrestling with. So that's one problem. Second problem is we make this all a lot harder than we need to. There's 7 million adults, give or take, in medicine, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. About 500,000, about 600,000 are MDs. The rest aren't. The rest are registered nurses, EMTs, what have you. So about 9% of medical professionals are doctors. The rest are people who work with those doctors so that these really expensive, really skilled people can do what they do well. In education, we've got about 6 million people in K-12. About 60% of them are teachers. And what happens is we treat them all pretty much interchangeably. If you walk into your local elementary school and you ask that principal to show you their best 4th grade reading teacher and their worst 4th grade reading teacher, I'll bet you dollars to donuts that they're both teaching reading about 80 minutes a day. They're both teaching math about 45 minutes a day. They're both doing 40 minutes of lunch duty. This is crazy. This is like you go in the hospital to have somebody perform cardiovascular surgery, and you look up at the cardiovascular surgeon and they're taking off their gloves. And you say, Doc, what's up? And she says, oh, don't worry about it. That was my hour of cardiovascular surgery. The candy striper is going to cut you open. She's real good too. It's as if Duke or North Carolina during the NCAAs said everybody's going to play 4 minutes of point guard, because we can't imagine how else you would do it. If you've got a better 4th grade reading teacher, and everybody in that elementary school will typically tell you that matters more than anything else, you would think that best 4th grade reading teacher's not going to do lunch duty, not going to do bus duty, not going to teach math, that they're going to do the bulk of reading instruction. And like any other team, those other 4th grade teachers are going to work with them, but they're going to try to build a team around what people do best. And just like the fact that we pay a cardiovascular surgeon more than the nurse that works with them, not because they're a nicer person, not because they have different mortality rates, but because they're harder to find and harder to keep, we should pay that reading teacher more than we pay the teachers who work with them. And now what we start to do is create an environment where we're squeezing more juice out of the talent we have. Instead of saying we've got to find 40 great reading teachers for that school, we say we need 6 great reading teachers and 34 competent teachers to work around them. So part of the problem is when we've got individuals like this, A, we lock them in, and B, rather than figuring out how do we extract what value we can and make them complementary role players, we say, it's the luck of the draw. We're going to just happen to see whether or not you get one of the good ones.
Yeah, and as we're speaking of reading, it seems like we're now understanding, just now, maybe in recent years, how important math and science is and how we have so gotten away from that. I take tours of groups to Turkey, and we visit schools, and they ask, do you have reading programs? How heavy are your... But, yes, there are. But math and sciences and technology is really actually at the forefront, So it's not that reading's being neglected, but there's a balance. And I wonder if there's just been an imbalance in our system in terms of this and our ability to compete with the rest of the world. And since we are global, and trying to compete for jobs after school in a global market, we're not meeting the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, so, one thing is because we tend to, not be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, is we pivot crazily from one challenge to another. Yeah. Fact is that we've got a system that asks each of our schools and each of our school districts to do everything for everybody. This makes it really hard to do anything well. So people figured out, there have been some interesting programs to teach 8th graders algebra. But when the Institute for Educational Research did a mega evaluation at scale, a meta evaluation, the results were negative. This makes all the sense in the world to me. If you're teaching 8th graders algebra, I completely believe that the right instructors with a carefully planned program, a thoughtful curriculum, and sensible techniques can make this work. I easily believe that when other people go to imitate it, and these guys do a couple days of big dollar flyby consulting, that the local teachers are going to do it poorly. But we don't actually have much of a mechanism for figuring out, all right, if we're trying to solve this problem, how do we let these folks hire and train people who will do it, and then put those folks in place in these schools or these systems? Everything has got to be homegrown. It's a little bit, our vision of how do you take good ideas to scale is that if it gets solved out in Portland or it gets solved in San Francisco or Tampa, that your local school district has to send a deputy superintendent and a couple principals out for a 2 and 3 days of dog and pony show. They get a fluffed up version of what this is, then they fly back and imitate it, and shockingly it doesn't work well. That's because it's usually not the glitz and the glamour, it's the people who are invested in it, it's the focus, it's the skills, it's the discipline, but this gets thrown by the wayside. Another piece, to think about this teacher piece, because teachers are the most important part of the puzzle here. 55% of school dollars go for classroom salaries. Teachers are the most important ingredient in any school environment. Something like math and science classes. There's very little reason to believe that a math teacher working with 22 kids is teaching real differently from a teacher working with 28 kids. If you spend much time in classrooms, these classrooms look largely interchangeable. But because we've got this fixation on class size, which A, means that we need to hire a lot more bodies, which makes it harder to be selective, which soaks up lots of dollars. What happens is, if a district has 10 great math teachers, and you're lucky in a lot of cases if you have too many great math or science teachers, what they need to do is then hire a lot more bodies to conform to the class size ratios. So if you have 10 great math teachers, you've got X number of lucky kids and everybody else gets the other folks. One question again is, how do you squeeze more juice out of the orange? One way to squeeze more juice out of the orange is to allow teachers, say if they choose, to serve more kids. What you might do, for instance, is every additional student that goes in a teacher's classroom, at some level, average teacher salary and benefits is about $72,000 a year. Average class size nationally is in the low 20s, low to mid 20s. So it's something like $3,000, $3,500 saved per pupil in an additional class. You might say to a teacher, tell you what, we'll split it with you as a productivity bonus. As long as your kids are doing well, if you take 28 kids rather than 22, you're saving everybody money. And we're allowed to get more kids in with a really high quality teacher. So if you're saving us $18,000 or $20,000, why don't we take half back for the district or the taxpayers and pay half to the teacher as a bonus because they're actually carrying a heavier load? What's interesting is, again, this gets us out of this holy war that we value-added merit pay is good or it's evil, and we're starting to talk about how do we reward educators because they're serving kids and tackling problems from reading to science to what have you.
Right. All right. We have time for a question. We'll wrap up. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. One about the negotiated agreements and unions. Do you think we have enough momentum in other states than the Wisconsin? Like, do you think something happening like that in teacher unions in other states? And the second question is about the current alternatives, like virtual schools or charade schools. Which one do you think is a promising trend?
Sure. It's a terrific question. So this first question on the kind of where we are with collective bargaining. So there's two parts to this, I think, both of which get lost. First is that existing collective bargaining agreements often allow superintendents and school boards to do more than they say they'll do. We've seen this in Wisconsin, for instance, that interestingly, when Governor Scott Walker pushed for a proposal which would give school boards and superintendents more freedom to negotiate down costs around health care and pensions, the superintendents say, we don't want this. It's going to cause too much conflict. We don't need it. So the same superintendents who are talking about how they don't have the dollars they need are also saying they don't want they don't want Walker to create this opportunity. So, and I think that's true across the board. If I did a study a couple years ago looking at the nation's 50 biggest collective bargaining agreements, and when it comes to teacher assignment, to work rules, to teacher pay, there's much more flexibility than most superintendents and school boards will tell you, but they tend to run away from it because it can create conflict, it can create headaches. It's easier to just kind of paint within the lines. So that's part of the problem, is that even if you create room, they may not use it. But it's also the case that we have collective bargaining agreements which tie people's hands about everything from which teachers are going to get laid off in terms of reductions in force, so that you're not allowed to take teacher quality into account in many contexts. We have rules around which teachers will be assigned to which schools and classrooms, limiting superintendents' abilities to make thoughtful decisions. We have rules that give teacher dibs on professional development, so that rather than sending out for training teachers who most need it, it's something that goes to the teachers who've been there the longest. So there are absolutely these problems. What's going to happen in other states? I think we're going to have to wait and see. I think it's just hard to know at this point. The second question, which addressed
virtual schools,
schooling, and
schools.
And I would just say, the evidence from my mind on charter schools is that charter schools, on average, don't do any better or worse than other schools, which makes a lot of sense to me. On average, when a whole bunch of people who want to do something start up a new one, you're throwing spaghetti at a wall. Sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't. Simple point is that there's some charters that are remarkable. Because charter schooling creates room to build fresh, we see schools like Achievement First and Yes and Uncommon Schools and KIPP Academies that are doing a terrific job. And in some places that have smart charter laws, like Massachusetts, or the context of New York City, you're seeing some really impressive charter results on average. But charters aren't a solution. They're an opportunity for people to do things smarter. Virtual schooling's the same. That some people get very excited about distance learning, about new technologies. Again, I think all of these things are opportunities. They're tools for people to start to solve these problems. And I think if virtual schooling is a way to revisit these rules and these regulations and these cultures and these contracts, then it's a powerful tool. If it becomes one more service that we tuck in around the edges of what's permissible, then I'd be surprised if it has a big impact one way or the other.
Okay. Shall we wrap up? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. It was
My
a wonderful
pleasure.
conversation.
Thank you.
Wonderful talk. All right. Please join me in thanking Dr. Hess.